they're not normalizing relations, but they're at least some sort of middle ground.
Israel does want peace. Israel does want security, but it's the peace of a master against a slave that submits to it, and Israel will not stop militarily until it loses escalation dominance or it completely controls the entire region. Can you imagine if Iran attacked Israel out of the blue, if they slaughtered Israel's generals and massacred Israel's leadership as Israel just did in Yemen? NATO would go nuclear. It would be considered the worst terrorist attack ever. But Israel does this, and then it gets to make the excuse that, oh, there's some proxy group that is resisting us, so we get to go and kill all the people who are supporting the proxy group.
Are they still getting any supplies of weapons through any means? Because the border's been closed off. I can't see anything getting into Gaza.
The population will continue to resist it as long as it's physically there. So they're actually removing the population. It's mass ethnic cleansing in order to stamp out all resistance. There is a plan to actually place the Gaza population in what are known as bubbles, but which could also be called concentration camps. They are being sorted out according to their political beliefs, so the irredeemable population that's considered radical will be sent to prisons and torture camps.
Professor Morris, he will call it ethnic cleansing as soon, if not as soon, if they remove the Palestinian population from Gaza.
What we're seeing right now in real time is a kind of final solution to a genocide starting to take form. And there's no negotiation that can take place until Israel gets what it wants.
Max, absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I think it's the first time we speak directly. I've been watching you for a long time and admire your work. And
Thank you.
Be a good conversation, man. Especially considering the circumstances, because we were just talking before we started recording about what happened. I think it was yesterday. Everyone thinks Hamas has been obliterated. They don't exist anymore. And it's just a matter of time before the IDF enter Gaza City and the rest of Gaza. But then we saw some pretty severe clashes yesterday. Some reports of IDF soldiers that were allegedly kidnapped by Hamas, but I think that turned out to be false. Can you give us an update on the latest developments as Israel looks at entering Gaza City?
Well, Netanyahu is embarking on his final solution for Gaza, which aims to forcibly relocate, in other words, ethnically cleanse the population in the north, which hasn't been contained yet, and extricate Hamas completely, destroy its armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, and all the other factions fighting. And he's doing so with a fairly exhausted reserve force. You're seeing casualties of guys in their 30s who are like professionals coming out of Israeli cities. There's a manpower issue. The Israeli army has announced that it needs to recruit 600 to 700 Jewish Americans every year to fight in order to maintain its manpower. And they've been suffering losses since July, when they embarked on Operation Gideon's Chariot, which was essentially a failed mission to reoccupy to take over large parts of Gaza and wipe out Hamas. So they're back at it again. And what we're seeing right now is, first of all, an attempt to capture the western areas of Gaza City. One neighborhood in particular, Al-Zaytun, which Israel's army has failed to take over 7 times. Every time they claim victory, and then they keep coming back and they keep fighting more Al-Qassam Brigade's fighters. And in the initial attack on this neighborhood, an APC was blown up. They feared that they had lost 4 Israeli soldiers. That wasn't true. 1 soldier was killed, 7 were injured. And it's sort of a humiliating start against a force that was supposed to have been attrited, if not completely wiped out, for the most powerful, well-supplied military in the Middle East. Meanwhile, what Israel's doing is mostly targeting the civilian population because they want them to leave. They actually have a long-term plan, which we can talk about, to confine and then expel much of that population through a series of incentives, but right now through violence. They're using commercially available dual-use drones to attack the civilian population. You're seeing video after video of civilians trying to bring water or aid back to their homes in Gaza City, getting attacked. This is meant to compel them to leave. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, has reported that Israel has planned to use artillery to force the population south. Pretty violent means of coercion.
How? What do you mean? Artillery
That they
against
will,
Hamas?
No, that they will actually attack areas around Gaza City to create a sense of terror, to tell the population that you can no longer live in this city. They're also using, and you can, go on Twitter X right now and see this. There's also footage that the Israeli military, their soldiers are putting out on their own social media of the wreckage and, like surplus Israeli military and vehicles and commercial trucks that they're turning into remote controlled robots. And they're using those to destroy residential areas around Gaza City. So people will have nowhere to come back to. Further north in Beit Hanun, where Israel suffered heavy losses against the Beit Hanun brigades, there's social media accounts of bulldozer drivers and contractors operating cranes who are just showing themselves destroying homes. And it's been reported in the Israeli media that these contractors get $5,000 about to destroy every home. So what we're seeing is a plan to destroy the entire civilian life, the entire civilian sector in northern Gaza, all the way down to the Netzarim corridor, to force that population south. And then there is a plan through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and through a more long-term kind of 10-year plan to actually place the Gaza population in what are known as bubbles, but which could also be called, and the Israeli press has used this term, Gideon Levy, the columnist at Haaretz, has used this term, concentration camps, where they're not allowed to leave. They are being sorted out according to their political beliefs. So the irredeemable population that's considered radical will be sent to prisons and torture camps, and the rest will be confined. And then they're going to be offered incentives to leave Gaza permanently, like a year of food subsidies. And then this supposed rebuilding process will take place. But this whole plan and what we're seeing take place was actually explained to me by a whistleblower from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a 25-year Special Forces veteran who you should actually host. He's a fascinating character, Anthony Aguilar, who
I've
told
had him
me
on the show.
Okay. Well, he told me when I kind of laid this out that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has been brought in, funded by Israeli intelligence, mysterious interests in Europe through a U.S. shell company and U.S. security contractors, it has a plan called Phase 3, where they're building a giant aid hub, which will be at the center of an area where about 500,000 people from Gaza will be concentrated and not allowed to leave. That plan has also been articulated by Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz. And once they're there, that will be the only place they can obtain food, which is why Israel had to one reason they had to get rid of UNRWA, the United Nations, because they were bringing people food wherever they lived. And then once they're there, they will be offered incentives to leave Gaza permanently. This is sort of the master plan, the final solution. And why do they have to leave Gaza? Well, it really speaks to why they're in Gaza in the first place. The people in Gaza are mostly refugees from what is today Israel. And they were mostly pushed there between the years of 1948 and 1950, when the self-proclaimed Jewish state of Israel was created. They can't be a part of Israel, and Israel passed laws to prevent them from returning to Israel, at the same time that Israel passed laws that would allow me, an American who happens to be Jewish, to return to Israel, a place where I have no roots. They did this because they needed to consolidate the ethno-religious purity of Israel. And so removing the Gaza population is about the character of Zionism and preserving the future of Zionism as a sort of ethno-religiously pure nation based on an ideology of exclusivism. This goes well beyond any politics or any deal making, and it speaks to why Netanyahu is unable to negotiate a settlement that leaves Hamas or any political entity that is controlled by Palestinians inside Gaza, because they need to do away with that population. And the plans go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a few questions. There's a lot of points made, and some of them are pretty shocking. So the first point you started talking about is Hamas. Let's just get an idea of the strength of Hamas today. I was under the impression that there's nothing left of Hamas, and I'm pretty critical of the bombing of Gaza, because I'm like, I'm surprised Hamas hasn't surrendered, which is a separate discussion. I want to ask your thoughts on why you think they haven't surrendered. But also, what's left of Hamas in your opinion? What have you seen?
Well, what Hamas has been able to do is repurpose Israeli munitions that have been dropped in unprecedented quantities on the Gaza Strip. I mean, we've seen the equivalent of something like 4 of the nuclear weapons that were dropped, maybe 6 to 8 of the nuclear weapons that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima dropped on Gaza. And I was in Gaza during the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2014, which left a large swath of Gaza destroyed. And so I was in areas like Beit Hanun, where I would see unexploded munitions. And these are like the size of, like a canoe. They're massive bombs. And people will tell you, don't go into that neighborhood. Hamas will send a bomb disposal crew in, and they'll reassemble that into what they call Shoaz bombs, which are like TV bombs. And you've seen them place them on tanks and armored personnel carriers by hand. Near Rafah, during the failed Operation Gideon's Chariot by Israel, one Hamas fighter actually managed to toss a Shoaz bomb into an open turret of an armored personnel carrier and kill 7 Israeli soldiers. So Israel's essentially importing weapons into Gaza, while they also have, the usual supply of AK-47s and these homemade Javelin missiles. And then when you talk about manpower, there's basically an endless supply of manpower in Gaza, because who are the Al-Qassam brigades? They're the orphans. They're people whose families have been killed and disappeared and arrested for generations. And so they are determined to resist Israel tooth and nail. They have nothing to lose and essentially everything to gain by resisting Israel. And the Al-Qassam brigades is something that, while it exists under the leadership of Hamas, is much closer to the local population and is much more respected by the local population than Hamas. I mean, when I'm in Gaza, people have enormous grievances about Hamas and the political leadership. It's like what you would hear any people say about their elected leadership. But there's generally a consensus on resistance, because they're an occupied people, they're a besieged people, and in Gaza they're refugees. They don't have the same kind of privileges.
So they have enough people. What about weapons though? I know you said they're repurposing ammunition or bombs that were dropped by Israel, but that can only get them so far. For them to continue resisting after this war has gone on for 2 years now, are they still getting any supplies of weapons through any means? Because the border's been closed off. I can't see anything getting into Gaza. And I'm just thinking, like, wouldn't they run out eventually? Not of manpower. Obviously, there's a lot of people that had their family killed by the war, and that feeds anger or resentment, etc. They could join the Al-Qassam brigades, the Hamas military wing. But I just don't get where they keep getting those weapons from. And the tunnels have also been mostly destroyed, haven't they?
I don't know what means they have right now, but I do know, based on interviews, that for example, I co-produced and directed a film called Killing Gaza about the 2014 war. Based on interviews that were conducted for that documentary, local Gaza fighters from the popular mobilization brigades, who are not Hamas, they're just sort of like the National Guard, said they were preparing for a 3-year war. So there's no way for me to know, but there is a certain logic to the Israeli plan in Gaza. It's a Zionist logic, which relates to demographics, as I said, because Israel needs to maintain a majority of Jews between the river and the sea. But there's also a military logic to it, which is that they believe the population will continue to resist it as long as it's physically there. So they're actually removing the population. It's mass ethnic cleansing in order to stamp out all resistance. And we're seeing this all across the region. I mean, we're seeing Israeli officials go on Israeli media and talk about forcibly moving 400,000 Lebanese people north of the Litani River because they see that entire population, which is mostly Shia, as a base of resistance. So Israel sees the population as a whole as a gigantic problem. And so I think that kind of trumps any discussion about military capacity. They even have a doctrine for attacking the population called the Dahiya Doctrine, which was pioneered under their former northern commander, Gadi Eisenkot, in the 2006 assault on Lebanon. And it's named for the Shia neighborhood in Beirut that was leveled by Israel. The idea is we level and destroy the entire civilian neighborhood in order to demoralize them to the point where they stop supporting the leadership that will resist us. So that is ongoing, and that's the Israeli military strategy. They're not really fighting traditional counter.
It's a doctrine. Yeah, it's a doctrine. It's a doctrine of disappropriate force. The IDF deliberately targets not just enemy combatants, but also civilian infrastructures, just ChatGPT explaining the Dahiya Doctrine, in areas linked to hostile groups with the goal of inflicting such massive damage that it deters future attacks. So essentially, Dahiya is known as a stronghold for Hezbollah. And what they would do, they would not only destroy military targets there, but they'd destroy infrastructure in Dahiya, because in their eyes, or it's got a lot of truth to it, is that this infrastructure is run by Hezbollah, is operated by Hezbollah, supports Hezbollah, but also the population there. If they destroy that infrastructure, then they force the civilian population to rebel against the Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza. Is that the objective of it?
That's the logic of it, and it's an incorrect logic. Israel thought it could employ this to some degree in Iran, and what wound up happening was the Iranian population, much of it which disagrees with the revolutionary leadership there, the Islamic Republic, rallied around the flag and became more nationalistic because they're seeing their neighbors' homes go up in flames. That's what's happened over the years in Gaza. It's what happened in Lebanon, especially since Hezbollah managed to kick the Israeli occupation army out in
2006, I think.
Well, in 2000, they kicked them out. And then 2006 was the second Lebanon war. And then in the most recent assault on Lebanon, which continues right now, Israel has violated the ceasefire with Hezbollah thousands of times. That's part of a separate strategy. But what we saw when Israel really went in hard on Lebanon was not just attacks for Hezbollah military leaders or, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, but attacks on the social network of Hezbollah, which they use to distribute bread and grain and provide education and schooling to a very generally poor working class Shia population. They wanted to cut the population off from the leadership that resists, and it always fails because it produces so much anger. But we're going to see this strategy play out continuously because Israel's only objective and its only way of holding on as an ethno-religiously pure state in a region where most people are not Jewish is through the Dahiya Doctrine, like total destruction of all resistance, including the population that supports it. So we're witnessing just so many human rights crimes, and it's not just random. I'm saying there's a logic to it all.
I have a counter argument to make, not for Gaza, because I'm pretty appalled by what's happening there. So it's hard to really. I try to always look at both sides of every coin. I'll try my best. It's been difficult for Gaza, but for Lebanon and Iran, I understand they hit a lot of the Iranian infrastructure. And in Lebanon, though, they were a lot more careful. The strikes were a lot more precision strikes when you compare to what happened in Gaza. Dahiya was hit pretty hard, but they gave a lot of warnings to the buildings. Now, it seemed that they did this intentionally for strategic purposes. They wanted the people to rally against Hezbollah, for Hezbollah to disarm. That's how I saw it. But the strikes were relatively, more carefully done. Would you agree for at least Lebanon, to an extent Israel as well?
I based on what I saw and what I was told by people who've been to Dahiya, no, I mean, they were blowing up businesses that belonged to Shia businessmen. They were attacking areas that they considered sympathetic to Amal, which is not Hezbollah. The strike to kill Hassan Nasrallah wiped out 7 entire apartment blocks. They wanted to be so sure that they killed Hassan Nasrallah in this underground bunker that they used, I mean, an unbelievable amount of GBU bunker buster bombs that weighed between 2,000 and 5,000 pounds. So I don't know how careful this was. It was just, and we also saw Israel for the first time attack near Hamra in Beirut, carrying out strikes near central Beirut.
But it was a pretty,
but certainly, yeah, they weren't wiping out
strike.
the entire, they didn't destroy the entire city like they've done in Gaza.
And I think this, like the objective was different. At least you'd see it as different. The objective in Lebanon is not to destroy all of Lebanon and kind of turn it into what Gaza is. The same for Iran. Each country had a certain objective. I think for Gaza, the objective is one that is more concerning. I'll dig into. And I moderated a debate on Thursday. The whole argument is what's happening in Gaza, a genocide. For me, I never got into that argument because I really didn't care what you call it a genocide or not. I just look at something, okay, this is wrong, this is not wrong. But when you look at the semantics, I never went deep into that debate. Then I went through it last week to try to understand what a genocide is, what is it defined by the UN Charter. And I spoke to Professor Bartov, and Professor Morris, both are Israelis, both were Zionists as well. One thinks it's a horrible genocide, ethnic cleansing. And the other, Professor Morris, he made an interesting point. He doesn't think it's a genocide by definition, and he doesn't think it's ethnic cleansing yet, but he will call it ethnic cleansing as soon, if not as soon, if they remove the Palestinian population from Gaza, if the goal is to kick Palestinians out of Gaza. Now, you're saying that is the objective, and you're seeing indicators that the goal of all this is for Palestinians to be out of Gaza and Gaza to be, integrated into Israel.
I mean, they openly say that's the objective. Israeli leadership openly says it. So
who? Because you've got all these different politicians. Who's saying that?
I can point to like Amichai Eliyahu, the heritage minister, calling for dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza to turn Gaza Jewish. But let's not listen to the fanatics that essentially are the linchpin of Netanyahu's coalition. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, has openly called for driving out as many people in Gaza and settling Gaza's north with Jews. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the security minister, is a leader of the Temple movement, which aims to replace the Al-Aqsa compound with a Jewish third temple and incite a religious war. But let's not listen to them. Let's listen to someone who's more close to the decision-making of the military. That would be Aharon Haliva, who is the head of military intelligence for the entire Israeli military, Amman. And Israeli media has just released comments that he made back in 2024 when he said that every generation Palestinians need to experience a new Nakba and 50,000 need to be killed. What is the Nakba? The Nakba is something that actually Benny Morris, who you interviewed, was one of the first Israeli historians to kind of confirm, while Palestinians, Walid Khalidi, for example, have written about this for years. The Nakba was the ethnic cleansing or forced removal of 750,000 indigenous Palestinians in 1948 in order to establish a Jewish state. And Benny Morris, actually, during the Second Intifada, came out and said the problem with the Nakba was not that it happened. The problem was that it was not more comprehensive because we failed to consolidate ourselves as an ethno-religiously pure Jewish state. And you can ask him about this statement and he'll repeat what I said. So he broke with the other kind of critical revisionist historians and said, we need to do more. And that's what Israel's doing. It's trying to finish 1948 with what is for Palestinians a new Nakba, which is why there's this global rebellion against it, because for so many people around the world, it just seems inhuman. It seems unnatural to witness a nation being destroyed and people being driven out of their homes to nowhere. And if I can make a quick point about Lebanon and what's happening there, because I know you interviewed Tom Barak, who's the U.S. envoy, and I think, we could be witnessing more destruction in Lebanon ahead. Certainly a new war with Iran is inevitable because I said Israel cannot secure its existence as a self-proclaimed Jewish state without crushing all resistance in the region, which means war, war, and war. In Lebanon, Tom Barak has said that Hezbollah doesn't represent, or it was his assistant, Morgan Ortegas, a Lebanese convert to Judaism, who said that Hezbollah doesn't represent the Lebanese people. Now, it doesn't matter what you think about Hezbollah. This isn't a comment on whether they're good or bad. But in parliamentary elections, Hezbollah and the allied group Amal win more votes by far than the group that the United States is trying to back, Lebanese Forces, which is the more pro-Western, pro-US, anti-Shia organization. Like three times more. Yeah. So like what they're trying to do is dislodge a popular group. And the only way to do it is by attacking and destroying the civilian population. And what the US ambassador in Lebanon said under Biden in a meeting with Lebanese forces, this was actually reported by the Lebanese paper Al-Akhbar, was you have to get out and get aggressive against Hezbollah. And I think right now the US agenda, and which is one hand with the Israeli agenda, is to ignite a civil war in Lebanon, to force Hezbollah and Amal to fight against the Lebanese army and the anti-Shia force, the anti-Iran forces. And that's why they're pushing disarmament of Hezbollah.
Can we go back and forth on this one? I disagree on this one, so it's going to be a good discussion. So when I spoke to Tom, he said, so I asked him a question, because I was split on whether Israel's incentives to have instability in countries like Syria and Lebanon to keep neighbors weak, or to have stability and allow for economic prosperity for both countries. So I was split on this. I was kind of leaning more to instability, especially after the strike, when the Druze and the government forces or the government allied forces were fighting in northern Syria. The IDF struck the headquarters in Damascus. And then obviously in Lebanon, they continue to strike Hezbollah targets. So I was worried that Israel's seeking to destabilize or keep this the region unstable. But then I spoke to Tom. He's like, look, I can promise you one thing. Israel wants stability. They, especially after October 7th, their mindset has changed. They want Hezbollah, which, to be fair, Hezbollah started attacking Israel first after October 7th. They want Hezbollah to disarm because Hezbollah is seen as an enemy to Israel, rightly so. And they, I think there was an article came out a few days ago, or report that the Syrian president, which I'm hoping to interview soon, the Syrian president and Israel and Netanyahu spoke, and they're not normalizing relations, but they have at least some sort of middle ground where they're going to keep the buffer zone, no military presence in that buffer zone between Syria and Israel, and have Israeli forces pull out of Syria. Do you strongly disagree with that view? Or do you think there could be some truth to it? You just need to see more indicators pointing to that. And I'd love to get your perspective on it.
Well, first of all, Tom Barak, in interviews with the Arab media, proved that he knew very little and had a superficial understanding of Lebanon. He didn't even know when Hezbollah was founded. He claimed that Hezbollah, in one interview, was founded in the 1970s. And the reality is that Hezbollah did not come into existence until Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. Israel invaded Lebanon and believed that the Shia population in the south would welcome them and throw candy at them. And they began abusing that population, and Hezbollah, with the assistance of Iran, took form. So it was Hezbollah is a response to Israeli aggression. Israel had a plan in 1948 called Operation Hiram, look this up, to occupy Lebanon all the way up to the Litani River. And it was only called off because they thought it was going to cause bad public relations. They've always wanted that land, partly because they want the river, the Litani River, and they consider it a buffer zone. So Hezbollah has actually defended Lebanon against Israeli aggression. And as soon as they put down their weapons, Israel will take that land. That's why Israel's annexing the West Bank, because the Palestinian factions there were defeated during the Second Intifada and agreed to coordinate their security with Israel. Now they're losing all their land and facing, catastrophic abuses at the hand of fanatical settlers. Why doesn't anyone ever ask Israel to lay down its weapons when it is the one that has been constantly attacking all of its neighbors, as we recently saw with Iran, in unprovoked fashion with surprise attacks, breaking ceasefire after ceasefire, over 1,000 attacks on Lebanon?
Would you say it's unprovoked? But would you say it's unprovoked, Max, what's happening with the proxies? And I don't want to take a side here, so I'm just trying to strawman the argument. Would it be fair to say it was unprovoked considering what the Houthis and the Hezbollah were doing to Israel with the support of Iran?
Again, this was a response to Israeli aggression. Can you imagine if Iran attacked Israel out of the blue and killed Israeli nuclear scientists who are producing nuclear weapons that are unregulated by the IAEA, which are not only pointed at the Middle East, but also Europe? If they slaughtered Israel's generals and massacred Israel's leadership, political leadership, as Israel just did in Yemen, where it killed the entire prime minister's cabinet, it would be NATO would go nuclear. NATO would attack. It would be considered the worst terrorist attack ever. But Israel does this, and then it gets to make the excuse that, oh, there's some proxy group that is resisting us, so we get to go and kill all the people who are supporting the proxy group. It doesn't really stand up to international law, to logic, or to any any kind of military strategy outside of straightforward state terror. So back to Tom Barak's comments. Tom Barak says Israel wants peace, that Israel wants security, and therefore all of these groups have to disarm while Israel maintains a nuclearized military that is occupying millions of people and committing, according to the Association of Genocide Scholars now, genocide in Gaza. And in a way, he's right. Israel does want peace. Israel does want security, but it's the peace of a master against a slave that submits to it. And Israel will not stop militarily until, one, it loses escalation dominance and someone forces it to stop, or two, it completely controls the entire region through force, and every single entity and population submits to it. And then what will we have left of international law? We'll be living in a law of the jungle, and in many ways we already are.
So you made a comment that if Hezbollah disarms, Israel will invade Lebanon, will keep some of that territory, potentially up to the Litani River. So that is a concern by many in Lebanon. So most people in Lebanon agree, the Lebanese armed forces have a lot of support from the Lebanese people. And many agree that Hezbollah merging into the Lebanese armed forces makes sense if they had peace of mind that Israel will not invade Lebanon again and try to annex some of the territory there. That is their biggest concern. Now, what you're saying, and correct me if I got it wrong, but you said if Hezbollah disarms, Israel will invade Lebanon again, will keep that territory. So Hezbollah is deterring Israel from keeping a lot of that Lebanese territory, like what happened in 2006. But what if the US offers some sort of security guarantees to Lebanon? Lindsey Graham did make the comments, kind of floated that idea. Tom Barak mentioned that idea as well. I know there's a big embassy being built by the US. I think the biggest in the Middle East that's being built right now in Lebanon. Is that a possible solution? Because you also, Max, cannot have, I can't think of any other country that's doing well that has a military within, other than the military of the government, has another armed force within the country while the country flourishes. So like the concept of having two armed forces does not work. But I also understand the concern of many Lebanese, the concern that you echo of having some sort of deterrence towards Israel.
Well, the Lebanese military, the Lebanese armed forces, is not a sovereign, independent military that defends the Lebanese state against outside aggression. It is a neo-colonial military that essentially exists to keep the peace inside Lebanon, and which hasn't always kept the peace. Look at the assault it waged on the Palestinian refugee camp of Nahar al-Bared, where it burned down an entire refugee camp amid a kind of hostage standoff. This is so the Hezbollah simply exists, and it has political power and popular support because it is the only force that has attempted to defend Lebanon against Israeli aggression. And it got caught in kind of a strategic gambit after October 7th, in which it made the decision to act against Israel to take the pressure off its ally in Gaza. But and then at the same time, Hezbollah was the force that prevented Lebanon from being infiltrated. And I saw this on the Syrian side of the border. They prevented Lebanon from being infiltrated by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which were actually being supported by elements in the Lebanese Future Party, and were right over the border. They took over one of the oldest Christian towns, Christian communities in the world, in Malula. And it was thanks to Hezbollah working with the Syrian military that those Al-Qaeda bandits who had actually taken nuns captive in one of the last communities in the world that speaks Aramaic, they were dislodged. But these forces it was literally right over the Lebanese border, and they would have come into Lebanon. So there's a reason, beyond the radical rhetoric or the support for Palestine, why Hezbollah maintains a base in Lebanon. And anyone who wants to just disarm them and remove them actually wants Lebanon to fully lose its sovereignty, and is playing the same game that the Trump administration played, or the United States government played, when it came in, signed a nuclear accord with Iran, then assassinated Iran's second leading official, its top military official, in Qasem Soleimani, which really shows the bad faith of the U.S. and why the U.S. is not trusted in the region, along with Tom Barak's colonial comments to the Lebanese press, accusing them of being uncivilized and basically animals. The U.S. has forfeited whatever goodwill it has in the region.
So first, I'm impressed by how much you know about the region, even though we disagree on some points here and there. You know about the Nahar al-Bared battle. Not many people know about this, or the Hezbollah battles with Sunni extremists from Syria. So really, really good conversation. We can go a lot deeper into this. I do think Tom Barak's intentions are good. You can call him optimistic. I know he said the word animalistic, but some people, when they speak their mind, Trump said worse things to journalists. When you go into, but one thing I don't know, I'm leaning to the fact that Israel is seeking peace in Lebanon. I don't think they'll pull out of all the territory. Call me naive. I do think Hezbollah disarming is best for Lebanon, but I could be totally wrong. Everything could change. Hezbollah disarms, and things only get worse from there. I do, and we can probably continue discussing about. First, I want to go back to Gaza, because you said some other comments there. Something about bubbles being formed. Can you elaborate on the plan? Then we can get into the discussion of what Gaza could look like 5 to 10 years from now. Because I'm seeing some news that is pretty shocking. Something along the lines of the U.S. rebuilding Gaza over 10 years, and all Palestinians in Gaza are being displaced to another territory. First, I thought it was off-the-cuff remarks, but now seeming more and more like potential policy moving forward.
Yeah, I obtained these documents. I didn't obtain these documents. They were uploaded to the Prime Minister's office website, Netanyahu's website, in Hebrew, that were produced, I guess, in early 2024 as part of something called Project Neom, which I'm sure you know about because you're in the region, and it involves the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And it was about connecting through a destroyed and then rebuilt Gaza, Israel through Gaza, and bringing Gaza into the Abraham Accords, and basically turning it into a kind of Dubai on the Mediterranean. The blueprints and the illustrations show like this flourishing paradise. And of course, Israel gets to take over the gas fields right off the coast of Gaza. So that's sort of a positive ricochet effect for Israel. But basically everybody lives in peace, but there's a 4-part diagram that begins with war, then shows Gaza being totally destroyed, which is what's happening right now in deliberate fashion. Then then the population is quote unquote de-radicalized and put in these bubbles, what I would call concentration camps. And then 4, paradise comes into being. So these were uploaded.
Can you talk about those bubbles? Can you explain those bubbles?
Yeah, I will. I just wanted to say, just for the reference of everyone
Please, yeah,
watching this, in case they want something to refer to. So those same blueprints and illustrations were then spun out into something which the Washington Post has just reported on. If you think that I'm like spinning out some crazy conspiracy theory, it's called the Gaza Reconstitution, Economic Acceleration and Transformation Trust, or the Great Trust. And it's been reported in many places, but the engine for this was 2 Israeli tech billionaires who also helped conceive the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you know, they have these aid hubs, which you'll see thousands of people descend on in chaotic fashion. They throw out boxes of aid, force mostly the men of the population to go out and compete to get some boxes as starvation descends on Gaza. And many of them get shot by the Israeli military, which is using live weapons as a form of crowd control. All of this described to me by Anthony Aguilar, but you can also see it on video. All right, these aid hubs are the only place where many people can get food in southern Gaza. So they have to come to them. And eventually the aid hub will be the basis of a larger population center, which will be controlled through biometrics, and which, according to the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, the population will not be able to leave without the permission of those who control the camp grounds, which would presumably be the Israeli military. They're planning one for 500,000 people in the area known as Mawasi, which is all war refugee tents right now. And, you know, as part of that, the biometrics will filter out people who have supposedly radical ideology, and they'll basically be disappeared. But then the bubbles are a transition on the way to this, you know, Dubai on the Mediterranean, and people who live in the bubble will be offered incentives to leave. They'll actually be paid to leave Gaza. But what we're seeing right now in real time, in my opinion, is a kind of final solution to a genocide starting to take form. And there's no negotiation that can take place until Israel gets what it wants, because Steve Witkoff and the Trump administration is essentially controlled by this foreign entity in Tel Aviv through the influence of figures like Miriam Adelson, who has contributed more to Donald Trump's campaigns than any other donor and is a proxy for Netanyahu. In 2018, Miriam Adelson said she wanted Donald Trump to annex the West Bank, and she gave him $150 million. And he's doing so now. He's now signaling that he will do that.
So I started looking into the impact, the influence AIPAC has over U.S. foreign policy, something I hear about a lot. And the numbers were pretty shocking. I think in any country having anybody really that seeks the incentive of another country, whether it's Saudi, whether it's Israel, whether it's France or Australia, where I come from, should not really exist, or at least disclose that this is what the intention is. But the way it happens with AIPAC, and you can explain it a bit more for the audience, and how much influence it actually has, maybe state some of the facts and maybe some of your assumptions or opinions on top of it. But essentially, AIPAC has U.S. citizens with a lot of money, mainly Jewish, that want the best for Israel. They're also American citizens, and they donate money to AIPAC, and AIPAC uses that money to influence U.S. politicians with their interests of Israel as their priority, which I think is just unfair for any country, including like for the U.S. or any other country. That just shouldn't be the case. Every money that's spent in the U.S. should be influencing politicians to do what's best for the U.S., not for any other country. But how much does AIPAC really have in terms of influence? I understand they do have influence, but when you look at someone like Adelson, how much she donated to Trump, Elon donated even more money to Trump, and that barely lasted a few months, the alliance, before it broke off. So if Elon, who donated the most money to Trump, couldn't have Trump not implement whatever, not pull out the what was it, the electric car subsidies that he had.
Yeah,
he pulled them off. So he couldn't influence Trump to keep those subsidies in place. You have Adelson impacting Trump to the extent of potentially ethnic cleansing Gaza. It's hard to really believe that's the case, that have that much influence in the country. Well,
I mean, I guess you have to give AIPAC credit there. Look at how much Qatar has given to Donald Trump. I mean, he bought, what did they give him? Trillions? And they seem to have very little political influence. Pam Bondi, the attorney general for Donald Trump, was Qatar's chief lobbyist. Kash Patel, the FBI director, he also did some lobbying for Qatar. And Pam Bondi and Kash Patel could not be more pro-Israel. And this partly has to do with them needing to serve the hegemonic political structure that's been established for generations in this country. It also has to do with the influence of AIPAC. And then there are points of leverage for Israel beyond AIPAC. As I mentioned, Miriam Adelson, Larry Ellison as well, who you mentioned, and runs all these data centers for Oracle. He is a diehard Zionist. His son, David Ellison, is reportedly going to buy CBS News and hand over production duties to Barry Weiss, who runs the Free Press, the premier voice of the kind of pro-Israel 1% in the United States. So AIPAC is something that represents a much broader structure of Zionist influence within American culture and politics. And what AIPAC does that's so effective is it focuses very closely on grooming politicians from the moment they enter Congress and even before. Actually, I went to the outskirts of an AIPAC conference in DC, the AIPAC Summit in 2011. I filmed it, it's on YouTube. And I was interviewing all of these Black class presidents from historically Black campuses across the US who were flown in by the pro-Israel billionaire Haim Saban as part of the Saban Fellowship Program. And I said, why are you here? And they said, as soon as I was elected class president of, Fisk University, whatever Black, historically Black college, I got a call from AIPAC and they offered me an internship in Washington and all these connections and a free trip. And I'd never been to Washington. So they're working at that level. But let's also look at John Ratcliffe, the the CIA director in Washington. I obtained tape from AIPAC's Congressional Summit earlier this year, or late in 2024, where the new CEO, Elliot Brandt, was boasting of how he personally cultivated not just John Ratcliffe, CIA director, but also Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Mike Waltz, who was fired but was the national security advisor. And he did it because they all came into Congress first as candidates who didn't have a lot of money, weren't well known. Like you and I are more well known in the United States than most freshman congressmen. They don't have no media presence. And so Brandt said he went down to suburban Dallas, where John Ratcliffe had been a small town lawyer, and said, hey, I like this guy. We're going to give him some money. And he served us all throughout the entire time he was in Congress. And now he's what they call like a helper in the Trump administration. So when the war with Iran was on the horizon and Israel was preparing to attack Iran, I was told by a Trump official, and I reported this all at the Gray Zone, that John Ratcliffe was functioning essentially as the Mossad stenographer, and that he was having meetings with Mossad director David Barnea and Ron Dermer, who's Netanyahu's top advisor, and just taking dictation from them. And then he was being isolated with the president, with President Trump through his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, and would give Trump all of this, oh, the Houthis are about to get a nuclear bomb from Iran. We got to go in now. We got to support Israel. And then Trump would just follow along. So that's how AIPAC gets its influence. And I mentioned Susie Wiles, Trump's chief of staff. She actually went to work for Benjamin Netanyahu in 2020 on his campaign for national leadership as an advisor. So where else do you see that kind of relationship? So it's a very focused campaign. It's very deliberate, methodical, and effective. And then finally, it's unregulated, just like Israel's nuclear program. AIPAC is not regulated under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, though it's clearly representing the will of a foreign government. Because
it is funded by Americans rather than governments. Some people say it's indirectly funded by Israel, but technically it's American citizens are funding AIPAC. And the other argument is like American citizens want America to support Israel as an ally. They have the right to lobby for that. This is the counter argument made to your point, which again, I don't agree with. I think American citizens should focus on the US. Israeli citizens should focus on the Israel. So I think in this whole argument, Israel's just doing the right thing by them. Like Israel's just using all these resources to try to do what's best for them. No criticism for them. They've done an incredible job at it. I think I'd look at Americans should look at their country's best interests above any other country, any other European country, any other ally?
If it's consensual, but it's not, they are trying to criminalize Americans for protesting them. They are lobbying constantly for new laws that criminalize the speech of Americans and American companies, that limit, they're pushing to limit even funding for disaster relief in states where companies supposedly boycott Israel. They're cut out organizations like Beitar are terrorizing Americans on the streets. And so it's not consensual. They're also training American police. They're training American security forces. They're pushing them to take a more expansive view of crime and to merge it with terrorism.
When you say you mean when you say they, you mean?
I'm just saying the Israeli government and the Israel lobby groups, okay. But this they're exerting a malign influence in the United States, and they're spying on us. 2019, a spying device was found on the White House lawn, maintained by Israel. Imagine if Russia had done that.
That's 2 seconds. That's confirmed or alleged?
Politico reported it. You can just take a second to Google that up right now.
Sorry, a recording device was found on the White House lawn. Yeah, and it was linked to Israel.
Let me pull that up for you. I can text it to your producer.
Yeah, or you could send it through them. I can put it up now. Let's read out what it says, the heading, what the title says.
September 12th, 2019. Israel accused of planting mysterious spy devices near the White House. The U.S. government concluded within the past 2 years that Israel is most likely behind the placement of cell phone surveillance devices that were found near the White House and other sensitive locations around Washington, according to 3 former senior U.S. officials with knowledge of the matter. Israel Gate. It's Israel spying on the U.S. more than Russia is, more than China is. They're completely focused on maintaining control of the United States. Once they lose their direct line to Washington, it all falls apart. And their Ministry of Diaspora Affairs is channeling Israeli state money into United States influencers and propaganda campaigns outside FARA. There's just a 2-tiered system where Israel gets a complete carve out from US law. Look at what Florida is doing with its bonds. Israel's bond rating has been downgraded to B constantly. They're like unrated bonds. The city of Palm Springs in Florida has something like 16% of its bonds invested in Israeli bonds. And is that a good use of taxpayer money or investments for the residents of that city? They have no say in the matter. And the mayor has said that he's doing so on ideological grounds, which is against the law. So, I could go on and on, but this isn't just about Israel doing the best for its nation with the support of, Americans. It's acting in many cases against the will of Americans. That's why Benjamin Netanyahu, during the Columbia University encampments, called for the National Guard to be sent against those American students. That's why Israel has been pushing the Trump administration to deport green card holders and permanent residents simply for writing op-eds critical of Israel, as in the case of Tufts University student. This is like poisoning our society. And you can see Israel sort of promoting hatred of Muslims through its various proxies and pushing religious warfare narratives in our societies. If you need to do all that to maintain your country, this goes well beyond traditional lobbying, and there needs to be some serious reform in American law. We need to register AIPAC as a foreign agent. There needs to be Espionage Act investigations. There needs to be a crackdown on Israeli spying. There needs to be a serious pushback on what Israel's trying to do to defund our institutions in this country in order to prevent Americans from exercising their First Amendment rights.
There's a lot you've said there, and it's probably a lot I need to look into, because I've been learning more and more about the amount of influence they have, especially AIPAC. It's been, every day I learn something new and I get more shocked. And I agree with what is needed in terms of espionage, taking action against all these different allegations. But it seems that it's already in some ways backfiring on whoever's, on the Israeli lobby. We've seen a lot of these fractures within MAGA, Tucker Carlson being one of the loudest voices, being critical of that. And, questioning a lot of things in a very logical way. I'm sure you've seen that interview with Ted Cruz. Do you see fractures in their efforts? Like, they can only push it so much. You're looking at the strongest military in the world, the strongest economy in the world, what I consider as one of the strongest democracies in the world. I just feel like you can only go so far. And what's happening in Gaza is about, especially if that leaked Gaza Riviera plan is actually true, that's pretty much ethnic cleansing. If that goes ahead, one could argue they've just gone that tiny bit too far, and we're starting to see the impact or the repercussions of that. Are you seeing that as well?
Well, of course. I mean, I talk to like neighbors in the DC area, just regular people, and they're just outraged by what they're seeing. 5 years ago, they would have never had this on their radar, or they would have been pro-Israel. They would have just been reflexively pro-Israel because they seem more like us. And what do we know about the Palestinians except terrorism? That's totally changed. A new University of Maryland poll shows that support for Israel among supporters of the Democratic Party under age 35 is in single digits. It's going to be wiped out within a generation in the Democratic Party. There's still a base of support for Israel in the Republican Party, but it's mostly people over the age of 40. Why? Because they're not following social media. They're watching Fox News and Murdoch media, which is just completely pro-Israel. So you're seeing a complete consciousness shift in the West, as well as this protest rebellion taking place. And, a new flotilla is going out with Greta Thunberg, who is one of the most famous activists in the world. So where does that lead us? It leads to more repression because our power structure in the United States remains completely committed to Israel, not just the Trump administration, but the Democratic Party as well. There was just a vote in the Democratic National Committee on whether to call for arms to be suspended to Israel until it ends this assault and rampage in the Gaza Strip. And that would simply be the most logical way to exercise leverage to force an end to this humanitarian catastrophe. And Ken Martin, the DNC chair, had to act against all of the young participants, everyone getting into the Democratic Party under age 35, and just put his foot down and say, no, we're not even going to, we're just going to shut down this resolution. He shut it down. And if you look at the background of the Democratic National Committee, it has an office in Arlington, Virginia, that was built from the ground up by the top donor to every Democratic presidential candidate going back to Bill Clinton. His name is Haim Saban. I mentioned him before. He said, I'm a one-issue guy, and my issue is Israel. He lives in Beverly Hills. He makes money off licensing Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and bad cartoons. But he said this to the New Yorker magazine. I'm a one-issue guy, and my issue is Israel. And so he built the entire headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. They're not going to be able to go against that. They will be kicking themselves out of the building of their own house. So that's the level of influence that we have at the top. So I think we're going to see more and more repression until a new generation can come into power. And we're already seeing it. Like, follow what's happening in New York with the likely election of Zohran Mamdani. He's running away from this issue of Palestine, but he feels like,
why is he running away from it?
Because he wants to focus on quality of life issues and stuff that's
domestic
more
issues,
unifying. And what can a New York mayor actually do? But traditionally, New York mayors have been the most pro-Israel mayors. They have the largest population of Jews in New York outside Israel, and most of them are pro-Israel. And then you have wealthy pro-Israel billionaires like Bill Ackman who are working against you. But he got elected because of this generational consciousness shift, and he hasn't backed down on his support for Palestine. He just doesn't want to deal with it. So the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, I should call it the Israel lobby, is going to try to make an example out of him. And they're going to try to destroy him the way they destroyed Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, so that no one dares get into politics again with his views. They don't want
But
to
what about people like yourself, people like Tucker, people other Candace Owens that are critical of Israel? Now, I'd look at them. If they have that much influence, then wouldn't they be able to somehow shut you down, shut Tucker, go pressure you guys to stop doing what you're doing?
You get attacked and they destroy your reputation. You get
Have you had that happen to you?
Well, of course. And, it's different for me. I don't totally understand where Tucker and Candace are coming from, because I'm Jewish and this issue is forced on you from a young age, and you kind of have to decide. And there's a growing shift among more progressive Jews in America towards my position. They just can't go along with what the Israeli government's doing. They have their various reasons. And so, when you're an American Jew and you take a position in a very prominent way, like I have, first the Jewish communal organizations attack you, and they try to emotionally blackmail you and go after your family. And I was put on various lists as like a top anti-Semite, and they thought, this would cause me
You were called an anti-Semite.
Well, not just that, a self-hating Jew, and they would hope that
we haven't even talked one thing about Judaism as a religion, not one thing.
Yeah.
And that's what's just perplexing to me, especially when you're Jewish yourself. I'm sure, imagine like Dave Smith being called anti-Semite. It just doesn't make. I understand if they want to use that term against someone like Tucker or Candace, they're not Jewish, so they can try to paint them in that way. But when you're Jewish,
yeah,
it's just a bit of a weird thing to say to you.
Well, it's certainly different than being Christian, because it's a religion that you sort of inherit through the matrilineal line. And it's a much smaller, more tight-knit community, but it doesn't have a Vatican. And so for many Jews in the United States who find it more and more difficult or unappealing to be religious or Orthodox, how do they maintain an identity as a Jew? Well, the easiest thing to do is to be a Zionist, is to support Israel, to wave the Israeli flag. So they're Jewish nationalists. And Israel has kind of articulated this identity when you go to the Western Wall. Like all the US politicians, in order to get elected, it seems like they have to go to this old wall and wear a kippah and close their eyes for a few minutes. But if you go to that wall, you'll see the wall is the religious part of the Jewish identity. Then you see 6 candles, very large candles beside the wall, which symbolize the 6 million dead from the Holocaust. That's another pillar of the Jewish identity. And then further back, like 100 yards back, because the ultra-Orthodox did not want this there, is the Israeli flag, which is the third pillar of Jewish identity as it's been artificially constructed in the post-war, post-Holocaust era. And this is how most American Jews, particularly of the older generations, understand it. And it's collapsing against the mantle of this genocide, the Israel part. But if you want to maintain an identity and feel transcendent as a Jew in America, then the easiest thing to do is just wave an Israeli flag. That helps explain like Bill Ackman, who spends most of his time trying to get into pro tennis tournaments and playing with money and so on. And the first time he actually put on tefillin, which is what religious Jews do to pray, was after October 7th. So the more embattled Israel becomes, or the more that you see the specter of anti-Semitism in your own society, the more Jewish you feel. And then you're supposed to kind of give money to Israel, and that confers on you a certain respect and authority within Jewish communal life. And if you fail to do that, or you go in the opposite direction, like me, it doesn't matter if you go to synagogue and pray. It doesn't matter how good of a Jew you are religiously, you can still be considered an anti-Semite and a self-hating Jew. And actually, Christian Zionists get more respect inside Israel, the followers of like Pastor John Hagee, who believe Israel's the future landing pad for the Messiah, than I do. And so under this artificially constructed Judaism of today, it's the Israeli Interior Ministry and not any organization of rabbis that decides who's the real Jew. And of course, I oppose that.
There's a lot there, Max, and you've been doing this for a long time. We went from the Nahr al-Balad in Lebanon all the way to AIPAC influence in the US. So just, again, much respect to the amount of knowledge you have. We can sit down for 3 hours. I know we kind of booked in 1 hour for today, but I'd love to have another conversation, just kind of focusing on like, one thing I'm digging into now, just understanding Israeli influence in the US and US foreign policy, and why it's so much more powerful in the US than we're seeing in like Europe or where I'm from in Australia. A lot of these countries, like Prime Minister of Australia, is trying to be critical, more and more critical of what's happening in Gaza, but the US isn't. So it's just a bit fascinating for me on that relationship between the US and Israel and that historical relationship. But I'd love to do another sit down with you, Max. It's been a real pleasure, and again, I really appreciate your time, man.
Well, thanks for giving me the time, and next time I'll book 3 hours.
I think we need it, man. I think you can give me like a crash course on how it all works. And I like how you also differentiate between what's fact, like we looked at that political article between the Israeli tracking device on the White House lawn, and other things, which is like your opinion is that if Hezbollah gives up weapons, then Israel will take up more territory, enter Lebanon, and then you give reasons on why you have that opinion. It kind of gives the audience kind of the facts, what you believe, and then allows them to make up their own.
Well, yeah, I'm transparent about what I believe and who I am, and you can judge me based on that. But if I get any facts wrong, then a correction is in order.
I appreciate it, Max. Thank you so much, man. We'll sit down again soon. Thanks, bro.
Thanks a lot, Mario.